Lord. Very good. So we're continuing our little discussion about the nature of Satan. If you're just joining us, the first lesson we talked about Satan's names, and we talked about the meaning of Satan, the adversary. We talked about him being the destroyer and the devil and all these other things, the accuser of our brethren. To try to get a handle on who he is. Last week, we talked about the nature of evil in lesson number 2, why God even has created or tolerates a situation where evil is possible. And we looked at some different ways to address the problem of evil in the world that are not satisfactory. We can't really doubt the goodness of God. We can't doubt the power of God. So how do we explain it? And what we came away with was it's the best possible way to the best possible world, that in permitting freedom of choice, God has also created a situation where the consequences of choosing wrongly happen. And that really does explain the presence of suffering and evil in the world. But eventually, after God does what he wants to accomplish through it, he will bring all evil and suffering to an end. So today, what I wanted to talk about is where Satan came from. If God is tolerating Satan, where do we get this guy? And again, I don't want to ever think about Satan as like a literary device or a personification of evil. He's a real spiritual being. And I think it's important that we understand him as a real being, one who does not have our best interests in mind. So the first thing is that Satan is an angel. And I know that sounds stunning to think about it at first, but Revelation 9 and verse 11 talks about the having as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name is destruction in both Hebrew and Greek. It sounds to me like Satan is an angel, and we're going to see a lot of other passages like that too. Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So that means if we're going to appreciate who Satan is, we need to appreciate what angels are. And angels are created beings. Angels worship God. In Revelation 4 and 5, we get that throne room scene where all the angels, really where everything present, everything in creation bows down and worships the one who is in the throne in the middle of it all. You may remember that angels refuse to be worshipped by others. Now, Satan in the Gospels told Jesus to bow down and worship him, but good angels normally refuse worship. Revelation 22 verses 8 and 9 is where John bowed down at the feet of the angel who had showed him these visions, and the angel said, "Don't do that. Stand up. I am just a servant of yours and those who heed the words of this book." So angels understand that they are not God. They're not divine beings. They're created beings. And as such, only the divine deserves to be worshipped. As we see them in Scripture, angels are numerous. We see them in some places, like one of my favorite ones is when Elisha prays that his servant's eyes would be opened, and he sees all these chariots of fire going round and round and round the city, protecting them from the Syrian army. There's lots of angels. Revelation even talks about myriads upon myriads of angels. It's 10,000 times 10,000. So there are lots of them, but they are also finite beings. They're not eternal. They're not coexistent with God. They're not as powerful as God. They are finite. I would say that angels were created before mankind, because Job 38 talks about how all the sons of God were rejoicing together while God was going through the process of creating the world. So it sounds to me like the angels were around before God created mankind, and maybe even before he created the world. But here's the thing, and this is where I'm going to pause for a second. If you'd like to turn to Hebrews chapter 1 and chapter 2, this is one of the best places to see the value, if that's the right word, of the angelic beings. Angels defy nature. They do things that human beings cannot do. They can travel faster, they can fly, they can, do all these wonderful, amazing, superhuman things. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're more valuable or that their role is superior. Hebrews chapter 1 is all about how Jesus is better than the angels. And after going through this list of the various ways that Jesus is better than the angels, he then turns in verse 14 and says what the angels actually are. And he says, are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? So that's pretty interesting to think of angels being ministers or servants on God's behalf, serving God, but on behalf of humanity, that they are rendering service for the sake of human beings. That's pretty interesting to know that even though they appear to be more powerful than we are, in some fashion, their role is subordinate to ours, if I can speak in a humble way about that. Also, while we're there, if you look at Hebrews 2 and verse 16, something else interesting is that the writer says that assuredly God does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the descendant of Abraham. And I suppose what's going on there is, since angels do not live by faith, they live by sight, they have access to God himself, there is really no excuse for an angel doing something that's wrong, choosing to reject God. Like, because I'm a human being, because I'm living in the flesh, I have certain appetites and needs that can make it very tempting to sin. For example, if I have not eaten food in 6 or 7 days, and I'm walking through the neighborhood and I see that my neighbor is cooling a blueberry pie on the back windowsill, I mean, my stomach is going to be growling and I'm going to be desperate. And I might walk over there and steal that pie and eat it. And I have committed a sin because the weakness of my body and the appetites of my body make that a temptation. I don't believe that angels have that weakness or that nature. Actually, another verse that I do not have on screen is in Matthew 22, which I think sort of says something about this. Matthew 22 is where Jesus is having a discussion with the Sadducees about the resurrection. And one of the things that Jesus responds to them in verse 29, you are mistaken, not understanding the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So it sort of sounds to me like, angels don't have bodies like ours that are subject to various appetites. So an angel doesn't have the excuse of saying, but I was hungry, so that's why I stole that pie. They're not subject to hunger. We can say, oh, that thing was so bright and shiny and I wanted to touch it. And God says to the angels, do you behold the very face of God? There's just no excuse for that. So it would seem like that's what Hebrews 2:16 means, that God does not give help to the angels, but he gives help to the descendant of Abraham, that human beings are redeemed by God when they sin, whereas angels do not have the opportunity for repentance. All right, let me pause and get some comments, questions. Stephen.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Bear with me one.
You're
Yeah,
good.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So that means if they're not, they can be, they can marry. So that's a good sign, as some people to contradict that theory, as the angels had children with women. Because if they don't do that, but they could do something, they could tempt man. It's like a fish. I don't like worms, but I could throw a worm to a fish, and the fish will grab it.
Right.
So, a donkey, I could put a carrot in front of it, and the donkey will follow it.
Yeah.
So even though they don't marry or looking for to have intercourse, they know the weaknesses of man, and whatever it is, they'll use it to entice.
Right, that's good. In fact, we'll say much more in weeks to come about the tricks that Satan uses, the tricks at his disposal to get us to deny God. That's good. Anybody else? Just on that initial slide about the nature of Satan as an angel?
Don,
Yes, go ahead, Doris.
I think that we are also protected by God because God says that He will not allow us to be tempted beyond our abilities. And I think that the angels don't have that protection.
That's a good point. The beholding the very face of God ought to be enough, right? In some way. Brian, go ahead. I mean, Larry, the cable guy.
I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to when he says gives help, but it may be that the only help that he's given us is, or the help that, I hate to say the word only, the help that he's referring to that he's given mankind is Jesus.
Yes,
That's
redemption.
right. That's the help we got, was we got the help of the forgiveness of sins, where the angels don't get that help.
Yeah, I do. That's the way I understand it, that the angels have no excuse for committing sin because they don't have a fleshly nature, and they do not live by faith because they live by sight. They have the very presence of God right there. Go ahead, Brian.
And I was thinking that for us, it's a huge distraction to be in the flesh because we have so many different desires that are tugging at us that we need to fulfill, where angels don't have any of that. So it's actually a lot bigger of a distraction as a human.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Good thoughts. Anybody else? Go ahead and just speak up if you got them. All right, let me go on to the next then. Some of these are gonna be some assumptions, so bear with me. I think it's fair to assume that Satan as an angel was created, and that when he was created good. I think that everything God creates is good. In Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. I'm not sure that it's fair to apply that statement to something beyond the world. Does that include the angelic beings? I don't know, maybe it does. But in any case, I do think it's fair to assume that what God creates is good. And so Satan would be included as a good angel, at least at first. So what happened? Well, Satan rejected God and he sinned. 2 Peter 2 and verse 4 says that God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell. Remember, that's actually slightly a different term there. And committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. So we see here that it is possible for angels to sin. They have free will just as we have free will. And I want to remind you from this passage that Satan is not the ruler of hell. He's not cavorting in the flames, having a good time down there. When Satan does finally get judged and sent to the lake of fire, he will not reign over anything, and he will not be enjoying himself. He will be tormented. That's the purpose of that. But anyway, Satan sinned. There's another passage that maybe, first, it also shows us that Satan led other angels into sin. Revelation 12, verses 7 through 8, says there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon and his angels waged war. So obviously the dragon, Satan, has got angels that are loyal to him who are fighting against the good forces. And somebody in the class this morning made a really good point that it's not a war with bullets and arrows and castles and everything else, but the territory that's being fought over is actually human beings and human hearts and minds. And that in a way, we are involved in the same war. We don't see it happening around us like pieces moving on a chessboard, but when we make decisions to either believe and serve God or to disbelieve and reject God, we are actually the territory that is exchanging hands in this heavenly war. And so Satan's goal, his long game, is to separate our souls from God eternally. And everything else he does is in service to that. Actually, while you're in Revelation 12, you might want to also look at verse 4, because it talks about how the dragon's tail swept a third of the stars from the heavens. And I don't know if this is correct or not, but I've often wondered if that is a symbolic way of describing how Satan led a third or a large portion of the angelic beings into rebellion with him. I don't really know, but that's often been the way that I've thought of that passage. So his sin, what kind of sin was it? If Satan doesn't have a body that gets hungry, if he is not subject to the flesh, what did he do that's classified as a sin? And I think Jude 6 speaks to this, that angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, God has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. And if we understand domain there, not so much as a place, a location, but as a role, as a function, as a job, and I think this begins to connect with the other things that we talked about in Hebrews 2. If it's the job of an angel to be a minister on behalf of the sons of Abraham, perhaps Satan, who in appearance and in ability seems higher than human beings, looks down at those fleshy, weak, pink things running around on the earth and says to God, you want me to serve them? You want me to run around and do your bidding on their behalf? I don't think so. I'm not going to do that. And that perhaps, that prideful statement has something to do with the sin that he committed. And indeed, I do think his sin is called pride in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 6. In that place, we have the qualities of an overseer. And it says that an overseer must not be a new convert so that he will not become prideful or conceited and fall into the condemnation incurred by the devil. So it would kind of seem like what happened there is that Satan became prideful and said, I'm not satisfied with the role that you have given to me, God. And it just connects so many dots, because obviously he's not going to just throw a random temper tantrum and try to, graffiti the walls of heaven. He's going to go after that very thing that made him so upset. You want me to be a servant on behalf of mankind? No, in fact, I'm going to spoil as many of those people as I can and rob them of your company. And so that, it seems to me, if you put the whole picture together, is what motivates Satan to do what he does in order to spoil the creation of God. All right, let me pause and see if I can get some comments or questions. And I do, by the way, want to speak a little cautiously, because, there's not one passage of scripture I can go to that says, oh, here's the whole thing laid out for us. We're kind of pulling bits and pieces from different places. So we do have to be careful. But I think what we've said so far is probably pretty reasonable. And by the way, it also probably teaches us something about the danger of pride among all the sins that we could commit. It's like, God understands it if we get hungry and we steal something. I mean, I don't mean that that's an excuse, but, it's understandable. It's a part of our nature. But when we have pride, well, that's just a high-handed sin against God. That's like what Satan did. And that certainly deserves God's judgment. Okay, Stephen, and then Brian.
Philippians 2 verse 5, I believe, summarizes, says, let us have the same mind that was in Christ Jesus. It's the opposite.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
of the devil. He said that being equal to God, he didn't let that stop him from becoming like unto us, humbling himself till death. So it's the opposite of pride. To think like Jesus is like understanding that submitting, obeying, being subject to one another, loving one another, helping one another, it doesn't lower us. Yeah. The highest Jesus, the Most High, did it. So we'll be like unto him if we do that. If we serve, he's not taking from us, but it's making us more like unto the Lord. The Satan, Bible calls him the prince of the power of the air.
Yes.
But that prince, he made himself prince pridefully. He took it from Adam. He deceived Adam. So what he had is stolen. He came to kill, steal, and destroy. He doesn't have nothing legal. He's a trafficker. So let's flee away from that attitude, as the verse that you just said.
Very good, Stephen. Brian.
I was thinking back to the three temptations of Jesus,
Mhm.
and it shows us the power and the domain that Satan has when you consider the fact that he offered Jesus control of the whole world. For Satan to be able to offer something like that means that he has that
Yeah,
to
at his
get
disposal.
right. So that really, it almost seems frightening, I guess, to know that Satan is, the heir of this world. He's got that power, and I guess it just don't. We shouldn't respect him in a positive manner, but we should respect the fact that he's got that much power.
Hmm.
Give him credit for that. Know your enemy. That way
Right.
you can beat him.
Right. That's exactly right. And to remind ourselves that Satan does not have our best interests in mind. Very good. Anybody else? All right. Put the screen back up. There we go. And then one other thing about this whole, where did Satan come from thing. So it's kind of hard to figure out the specific point in history where Satan rebelled. John describes him as a murderer and a liar from the beginning. The question is, the beginning of what? Certainly not the beginning of time, right? I do want to emphasize this over and over again, that Satan is not co-eternal with God. Satan is not powerful, sovereign with God. That was what we studied last week about dualism and Star Wars, that good and evil, the dark side of the force and the light side of the force, are butting heads throughout history, and neither one of them will ever emerge as the winner. They'll always go at each other because they're both eternal and powerful. That's not God. Satan and God are not equals. Satan is a created being, and eventually, when God is ready to, without any help from any of us, he will destroy Satan, and that'll be the end of that. And evil and suffering will be removed from the human situation, at least for those of us who are the redeemed. So when is it that Satan decided to rebel? I don't know. I mean, was it before he created the earth? Maybe. I kind of tend to think, if I were forced to nail this down, it would be when he decided to take upon himself the form of the serpent, and through the serpent to tempt Adam and Eve. That probably marks, if not the decision, at least the first stroke in his efforts to destroy the pinnacle of God's creation, which is mankind. I think that you can, and we'll do this next week, we'll actually trace some different points in the fall of Satan. But I think that's probably the spot where his pride took over, and when he decided to rebel against God and to destroy God's creation. So that seems to me a pretty good summary of where Satan comes from, of what Satan's nature is. And next week, we'll talk about where he's going. Stephen.
Yeah, the specific place, how can we tell? But the way he started was within him, his heart.
Mm-hmm.
Because from the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So whatever wickedness and evil that because he goes both ways. From the abundance of the heart of God, his mouth speaks. So from the abundance of everyone's heart, the mouth speaks.
Yeah.
Just from what. So his heart got full of pride at some point in history, and that's what got him down.
Which amazes me, right? Because like what James 2 talks about, verse 19, I think, that the demons tremble with fear. Satan must have known that he's not going to win and that God is going to destroy him for this. But his pride was so much so that he was willing to suffer even that for the sake of wanting to harm God. And pride is just a really dangerous thing. Maybe one of the most dangerous sins of all. So, anybody else? All right, well, this isn't a really complicated lesson this morning, and there's a little speculation, but I just think this is so fascinating. And again, the purpose is to get our minds wrapped around the nature of our enemy, so that we will best know how to resist him and defeat him, and to know that his fate is sealed and that we do not want to be on his team. Any other comments or questions? All right, well, I'm going to stop recording and